Michael Hastings' Rolling Stone article that ended the career of General Stanley McChrystal starts like this. Quote, "How'd I get screwed into going to this dinner?" demands General Stanley McChrystal. It's a Thursday night in mid-April, and the commander of all U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan is sitting in a 4-star suite at the Hotel Westminster in Paris. He's in France to sell his new war strategy to our NATO allies, to keep up the fiction, in essence, that we actually have allies. Since McChrystal took over a year ago, the Afghan war has become the exclusive property of the United States. Opposition to the war has already toppled the Dutch government, forced the resignation of Germany's president, and sparked both Canada and the Netherlands to announce the withdrawal of their 4,500 troops. That's how Michael Hastings' article about McChrystal started. Those troops from the Netherlands actually did leave Afghanistan yesterday. 1,900 Dutch soldiers pulled out of Afghanistan this weekend, a couple of months after the ruling coalition in their government was thrown out of power, in part because of how much the Dutch really did not want to keep their troops in that war. It's not that hard to imagine a government being thrown out over dissatisfaction with an ongoing land war in landlocked Central Asia. I mean, well, look what happened here about Iraq in 2006.
Last night's vote was seen as a message, a protest vote on the war in Iraq.
Exit polls from Tuesday's election show that voters want a new approach to the war in Iraq.
It turned out to be a referendum on the president and the war in Iraq.
Now, most Americans are sick and tired of the war in Iraq, and Tuesday they made their voices heard at the ballot box.
That was the 2006 election when America got introduced to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid because Democrats took control of both the House and the Senate, in large part on the strength of anti-Iraq war sentiment in this country. By the next election, which started about 5 minutes after those midterms, Democrats positioned themselves early in the presidential field on the strength of their opposition to the Iraq war as one of the definitive early edges that candidate Barack Obama took over the then presumptive nominee, Hillary Clinton.
The last point I'll make is on Iraq. Senator Clinton brought this up. I was opposed to Iraq from the start. And I say that not just to look backwards, but also to look forwards, because I think what the next president has to show is the kind of judgment that will ensure that we are using our military power wisely.
You know, several people who were adamantly opposed to the war in Iraq, like Senator Durbin, voted the same way I did and said at the time that if he thought there was even the pretense that could be used from the language in that non-binding resolution to give George Bush any support to go to war, he wouldn't have voted for it. Neither would I.
She voted for a war to authorize sending troops into Iraq, and then later said this was a war for diplomacy. I don't think that now that may be politically savvy, but I don't think that it offers the clear contrast that we need.
By the time Barack Obama was elected president, the Iraq war wasn't the definitive political issue it had been early on in the campaign, in part because, frankly, the financial crisis overtook everything else in the universe of voter concerns, but also in part because U.S. troops leaving Iraqi cities had quieted the daily reports of Americans in danger there. Still, though, the new president pledged in his inaugural address to leave Iraq to its people. And just over a month later, he spoke in detail about doing just that. He spoke about it to the Marines at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, saying, quote, "Today I have come to speak to you about how the war in Iraq will end. Let me say this as plainly as I can. By August 31st, 2010, our combat mission in Iraq will end. I intend to remove all U.S. troops from Iraq by the end of 2011. And so it goes. Say goodbye to Operation Iraqi Freedom. That ends at the end of this month, when Operation New Dawn begins. As of a month from now, Operation New Dawn is the name that will be used to describe what 50,000 American troops will still be doing in Iraq for another year. The president today addressed the impending change of mission in Iraq when he spoke to the vets group Disabled American Veterans in Atlanta.
As a candidate for president, I pledged to bring the war in Iraq to a responsible end. Shortly after taking office, I announced our new strategy for Iraq and for a transition to full Iraqi responsibility. And I made it clear that by August 31st, 2010, America's combat mission in Iraq would end. And that is exactly what we are doing, as promised and on schedule.
It is true that what's happening in Iraq is an end to the combat mission this month, and it is true that President Obama is doing what he said he would do about Iraq. But he's also doing what George W. Bush obligated us to do in Iraq. Our war toppled Saddam Hussein, of course. Iraq got a new government. Even though the UN never signed off on Bush invading Iraq, the way we could keep our troops there without being in violation of international law was that the UN Security Council annually said it was okay for us to stay there. But the Iraqi government asked the UN to stop saying that, to stop giving authorization for foreign troops to occupy their country. And so George W. Bush negotiated a date certain by which we promised to leave. And now the president coming after him is making good on that deal. The exact end date for the combat operations part of the mission slid around for a while, but it settled on the end of this month. But the all-clear, all-out date is still this time next year. It's the date that Bush agreed with the Iraqis. Same plan to leave, different presidents. We are in year 8 of one of our wars. We are in year 9 of another of our wars. Both started during/by the previous administration. Should we expect that we get a break from that now? President Obama today with the disabled American veterans told the story of an Army Ranger who was severely wounded on his 10th deployment. His 10th. The man is 27 years old, 10 combat deployments. Does having a new president mean that the last president's wars get wound down? Is there a tangible life and death difference between presidents now on national security, between Democrats and Republicans? Will the Afghanistan war really end, and soon? Is it possible that another war won't just take its place? Our next guest for the interview tonight says that the answer to those questions is probably no, that the foreign policy consensus is beyond politics, beyond partisanship, that the price of admission, the criteria for being taken seriously in Washington, is embracing a vision of America that essentially requires us to be at war one way or another all the time. He is one of the most insistent, readable, compelling critics that we've got in this country right now on any subject. He is Andrew Bacevich, and he's next. Stay with us.